Lovely to see you all. Thanks so much for joining us this evening and a really warm welcome to the IOE. I'm really pleased to be introducing this evening's lecture, which is actually our last professorial public lecture for the academic year. So really our last opportunity this year to share and celebrate our senior colleagues' research. And this is actually a double celebration, coinciding as it does with the 60th anniversary year of the birth cohort study, the study that forms the basis of what you'll be hearing from Professor Goodman this evening. First, the usual couple of housekeeping matters. For the tweeters among you, you'll hopefully have seen the Wi-Fi login instructions as you arrived into the room. The Twitter hashtag is #IOEdebates, all one word, that's #IOE. Oh, sorry, I'm getting the wrong one. #IOE lectures, all one word. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the alarm sounds, please take the doors at the back of the hall, which will lead you up some stairs and out onto Bedford Way. But without further ado, to the lecture. Our speaker is Alissa Goodman, Professor of Economics, Principal Investigator for the National Child Development Study, otherwise known as the 1958 British Birth Cohort Study. And she's also director of the Centre for Longitudinal Studies here at the IOE. A graduate from Oxford and of Birkbeck College, University of London, Alissa spent her early career at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, later as its deputy director. She moved to the UCL Institute of Child Health as Professor of Economics, and then in 2013 to the IOE to lead the aforementioned 1958 cohort study. Her research interests centre on education policy, inequality, poverty, and the intergenerational transmission of health and well-being. From there, her work has ranged across the socioeconomic gap in child outcomes and the implications for outcomes later in life, trends in income inequality across the generations, and child and pensioner poverty. She also has extensive experience of conducting large-scale policy evaluations for government in relation to education and employment. In joining the IOE when she did, Alissa played a major role in designing the survey of the 1958 cohort members as they entered their 60s, and for many of them, a really significant new life stage. The birth cohort studies, of which there are currently 4, 1946, 1958, 1970, and 2000, the Millennium Cohort, really are the jewel in the crown of UK social science, and we're incredibly proud to host all 4 within UCL, 3 within the IOE's Centre for Longitudinal Studies. These studies follow nationally representative groups of individuals born in a given year from cradle to grave. Internationally renowned, they represent a tremendously rich resource of research within and beyond the social sciences that can help us understand the important factors in life trajectories within and across generations, be they trajectories in education, employment, or health, to name but a few of the facets of our lives, and they inform public policy and public understanding. In other words, Alissa and the research team and the study participants she leads are to be admired and treasured. Now, Alissa's stellar academic career is marked by exceptional and inspirational scholarship and leadership. And this evening, we have the opportunity to hear more about her work, and I'm delighted to invite Alissa to present her lecture. Alissa.
So thank you very much, Becky, for that introduction, and to all of you for joining me this evening. This is my professorial lecture, so it's a wonderful chance to celebrate with all of you this important milestone in my life, and it's lovely to have all of you here. And it's especially nice to see so many colleagues, close friends, and family here, as well as many of you who I don't know. So thanks very much to all of you for coming and for taking an interest in my work. And for the very hardened football fans among you, I know you're giving up the chance of seeing Saudi Arabia playing Uruguay just now. So Hannah, you got them in your class sweepstakes, didn't you, Saudi Arabia? So, hopefully that's a good decision. And so Becky's introduction ran through some of what I was going to say to you. But as Becky said, I'm director of the Centre for Longitudinal Studies here at the IOE, and we're part of the social science research part of the Institute of Education, which in its own way is as famous as the amazing teacher training and education research that goes on here. So the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, we're in some Georgian buildings, just a little outpost down the road from here on the corner of Gordon Square. This was us at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies out in Gordon Square last Tuesday morning, or most of us. In terms of what we do, as Becky said, we run 4 national longitudinal studies here. 3 of the 4 of them are national birth cohort studies. So essentially we follow people from cradle to grave. So the oldest study that we run is the NCDS, the 1958 cohort, all the way down through to the Millennium cohort, which is a large group of babies all born around the time of the millennium. So as Becky said, as well as being director of that centre, I'm PI of the oldest of the cohorts, the NCDS. So what I'm going to start to do in my lecture tonight, I'm going to start by telling you about a current project that I'm working on now using the NCDS that I'm really excited about. And then in more professorial, sort of inaugural lecture style, I'll move a little bit more onto sort of a personal story, a little bit about some of the people that I've worked with over time and the ideas that have brought me to where I am now. So just first, a little bit more about NCDS. So it really is an amazing feat of post-war social engineering that I'm able to say as the study director now that 98% of all the babies born across the whole of Great Britain in a single week in March 1958 were enrolled into that study, and they were enrolled by their mothers and by the midwives that helped to deliver them. And you can see from that timeline, I'll come back to that timeline, or I'll refer back to that timeline in my talk a little bit. But you can see from this timeline that I've drawn here that was about 17,500 babies who were enrolled into the study at the start of their lives. And at the start of the study, it very much had a biomedical focus. So the investigators were especially concerned about the very high rates of infant death at that time and what could be done about that. But once the study was traced beyond birth and into the school years, and then throughout the school years and into the adult life of the cohort, it changed from having a solely biomedical focus to a very wide and multidisciplinary focus. As Becky mentioned, it's also been an important milestone for the study and for all the study members this year, because we celebrated the 60th birthday back in March of the study. And this animation here was something that we produced for a 2-day conference that we put on to mark the scientific contribution of the study over all of its 60 years. So it really has been a very important study in many, many ways and for many different areas of scientific investigation. And one kind of very sort of visual indication of this is this sort of mountain, literally a mountain of publications that's come out of the NCDS going back to 1961 and then forward in time to the present day, especially in recent years. And just to say that some of that research and the publications from that study comes from our own research group at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, but actually it's used very widely by scientists all around the world, spanning all kinds of disciplines. And in terms of some of its most important or famous findings, here's just a few. So in public health, just for example, it was the first study that showed conclusively that smoking in pregnancy was harmful to babies, which evidently has had huge impact. And this is just one public health message from the NHS that's used today. In the middle one there, it's been an extremely influential study for shaping our knowledge about the childhood origins of mental health problems, so the developmental origins in childhood of mental health problems among adults. And this picture I snapped at Vauxhall Tube Station the other morning. It's never too early to spot the signs. I'll come back to that in my talk later. And then in social policy, it really was the first study to show conclusively and in a nationally representative way the very strong cycles of between and across generations of economic deprivation, so the fact that deprivation cycles across generations, and was something that we were able to show from the NCDS for the first time. So more generally, with the birth cohort studies that we run at CLS and the NCDS in particular, these are the types of scientific questions that typically people answer using it. So the long-term effects of early life circumstances, intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage, individual change and trajectories over the lifetime, and also using the cohorts that we run in combination, increasingly they're used to show very powerfully the changing experience of different cohorts. And I'll try and touch on all of those in my talk. But as I said, I wanted to start with a project that a few of us here in CLS with some international collaborators are working on now that we're really excited about. And for that, I'm going to take you back. I said to remember the timeline, so I'm going to take you back to the age 11 sweep of the NCDS, so back in 1969. And the cohort members, so you can imagine them up and down the country, they were all babies born in a particular week in 1958, so they all shared a common birthday. There were typically maybe 2 or 3 in any one school who were in the study. And so Hannah, you're nearly 11, so it would have been in your year 6. They typically were taken out to do some cognitive tests, maybe some maths and some reading and some general ability. But at the age 11 sweep, the study directors had a different idea, and they decided to get the cohort members to write an essay. So I'll tell you in a moment what the essay was, but the oral history of the study tells us that the study directors knew full well at that time that there'd be all these 11-year-olds out there writing these reams of essays, loads and loads of words about the topic that they were asked, and actually they had no ability to analyse what was written at any kind of large scale at all. And the oral history says that they did it because they hoped that in the future people would be able to take an interest in what was written, and of course we really do. So in this project we're using some really very new tools from coming out of machine learning and statistical analysis and computer science to look at what was in those essays, to analyse them at scale, and to see what was written in those essays, what that can tell us about the future of the study members who we went on then to follow across the whole of their lives. So this was the essay that the children were asked to write. They were asked, imagine you're now 25 years old, write about the life you're leading, your interests, your home life, and your work at the age of 25. So here's just one example of the many, many essays. So in total, we think around 13,500 children wrote the essays, and we found 10,500 on record in the archives at CLS that we've been able to transcribe. But here's just one example of it. And you can see this was a girl. She wrote, I'm sitting in a ward on night duty. I will soon be a... She first wrote staff nurse, and then she crossed it out and put sister. I think I enjoy the work in hospital, although the work is hard. Now, normally, all these study members have joined the study and their parents signed them up under the conditions of anonymity. So we collect lots of sensitive information about them and we don't make their names public. But for the purposes of the 60th birthday of the cohort, and also as part of this essays project, we got in touch with a few of the study members and we asked them would they mind sort of going public with their essays and to tell us about what they thought when they reread their essays again and how their lives have really turned out. So this is mainly a sort of quantitative analysis that I'm going to tell you about, but it also has a very strong sort of personal touch. So the 3 of the study members who came forward and they sent us their age 11 photographs were Sally Seth Smith here on the left, Steve Christmas, and Jackie Adkin, and many thanks to them for agreeing for their photos to be shown to you. So not only did they agree for their photos to be shown to you, but we've actually been doing a lot of work in the press with them just recently. So this was a piece that came out in the Daily Mail in relation to the essays project about do childhood dreams come true? And in fact, the first essay, the example essay that I showed you was Sally's. And you can see this headline in the Daily Mail I particularly love, because she said, I wanted to be a nurse, and then I realised that girls can be doctors. So she's been a GP for many years. But her sort of experience exemplifies the experience of many women in this cohort. So compared to their mothers and their grandmothers, this was an extremely upwardly mobile cohort of women. They went on to take up careers that they perhaps never imagined that they really could. And And that was Sally's story. And you can see her looking fabulous in her sort of before and after. Now she's 60 there in the paper. So you can see Steve Christmas's, Steve down here, he tells a story of great adversity in his childhood and what he's done to kind of overcome those adversities to go on and have a really good life. And again, that's another theme that comes out very strongly in the research that we can do on NCDS and the other birth cohorts. What are the factors when people have had a tough childhood, whether that's through poverty or maltreatment or other negative experiences? What are the factors that can really help people turn that around and be resilient to early life experiences? And then Jackie here on the left, her story, I still regret money woes, killed off my ideal career. So she talks about how she'd had dreams of setting up a hairdressing business, but financial circumstances, she came from quite a poor background, didn't allow that. And then again, the sort of perpetuation of potential sort of economic hardship across generations is something that we look at a lot in our study. And so this was a piece in the Times. They tried to predict their future. Did they get it right? And I actually met Sally and Steve, and Jackie was around yesterday as well. We were all filming for the One show, so about this same story and about the 60th birthday of the cohort. So I think it'll be on in a couple of weeks' time. So I hope maybe some of you will tune in and watch us talking about this same thing. But as I said, these personal stories are all embedded in actually what is quite sophisticated statistical analysis that we've been able to do now on these essays. And I think many of you will be, some of these analyses of text at large scale are very much in the public eye at the moment. So they've become very familiar in recent times as we've been doing this project, mainly because the huge availability of what people are writing on social media and making sort of public or available to be used in certain ways or kind of not, but still being used. In the case of Cambridge Analytica. But essentially, a lot of the analysis that people are, textual analysis that people are doing nowadays on large bodies of text are very short-term analysis. So they're looking at, how text written now relates to other things that they can see that are going on for people now. And there's very little on a large scale looking over a longer period of time. So there's one sort of quite famous exception to that, and this was this very famous nuns study that was published about 15 years ago now and had a big splash here, just an example, in Time magazine. And here the investigators had, there were 180 nuns who had written autobiographical essays as part of what they did to join the nuns order. Those essays were written when they were in their late adolescence or their early 20s. They'd written about their lives and why they wanted to join the nuns order. And in this particular research, the investigators went through and, for example, they found, working with the nuns much later in life, that more use of positive emotion words in their autobiographical essays in their 20s predicted lower mortality rates later in life. And also greater use of more complex language structures in the essays predicted lower risk of Alzheimer's and dementia later in life. So there were these very strong links between language used in their early 20s with later life. Now, while our work is in the spirit of the nun study, that was 180 nuns, and we now have 10,000 of these essays. The nuns were a very particular group, women who had applied to join a nun's order and then stayed there all their lives. And also the type of analysis that was doable then was what we now think of as closed content analysis. So the investigators went out to look for specific ideas and concepts in there, like positive words versus negative words, or complex structures. Whereas the types of things we can do now are quite different. So it's a different application. It's a big step forward in a way. And one of the things that we can do is use what's called open content analysis. So use statistical tools and relatively light statistical assumptions to discover what the content of the essays was from a statistical point of view rather than from the filter of our own particular minds. So the first sort of step in this project has been to generate something which we call topics from the essays. But essentially the topics are just groups of highly related words and phrases which typically cluster together in the essays. And they're usually shown, there's a sort of visual representation that you usually do of them, like this one here, which is one of the 100 topics we specified for our machine learning algorithms, to look for 100 topics. And there's just one example of them here that I've picked out. So we didn't tell the computer to go and look and see if there was anything to do with phishing in there, but we might use our own interpretation and call that one the phishing topic. And this is an example of an essay which mentioned the phishing topic much more than was typical in the rest of the essays. So you can see this is a boy. And he wrote, he's 25 years old and I work in a sports shop. My hobbies are going fishing and I like sea fishing the best. When I'm sea fishing, I'm swimming for mackerel and other fish. So obviously that's a major topic in his essay. But there were other things he mentioned as well. This is just to illustrate the point of how we construct our data. So he says he lives in a flat and he's going to buy an Aston Martin. And sometimes he plays football. So for each study member in each essay that's been written, they get a score for every topic that comes up in the analysis. And so this boy will have had a fairly high score on fishing and then slightly lower scores, but still positive scores on some of the other topics. So if you want to see among the 10,000 essays the topics that were most highly predictive of being a boy, so this is what they were. So you can see the fishing topic is down there. These are in order of predictiveness. But there's an awful lot of sport in there, as you can see, both watching and playing, something I'll come back to. Lots of vehicles, driving vehicles, jet planes, a little bit about kids and wives and children. Now, thinking about keeping Sally in mind again, and then just so you can see the topics that were most predictive of being an 11-year-old girl back in 1969. These are the word clouds that most strongly predict for them. So lots about husbands and children and babies. You can also see the three most sort of popular or common professions for women at that time when the girls were writing. So teaching, nursing and hairdressing. So Sally, of course, would have come up strongly on, her essay scored strongly on that particular topic. And I'd say when you read the essays, it's almost entirely obvious when you read one whether a boy or a girl wrote it. There are a set of essays written by a study a few years ago, by 11-year-olds in a study a few years ago in Australia, in the study Growing Up in Australia. And we're now forming a joint collaboration to do the same analysis with them because it's going to be incredibly interesting to see how those gender differences, for example, have changed. But not only were things very demarcated by gender, social class and social inequalities are another thing that comes up incredibly strongly in these essays. So here is an example of the start of an essay from a boy who came from a high social class background. So he said, I have a good job as an engineer and live on the outskirts of the town. I own a large house, etc. And here is an example of an essay from a boy who came from a manual working class background. And you can see his essay is entirely different. I'm now 25 years old. My job is a builder. I go to work at 7 o'clock and I come home at 5. So in terms of the topics, so using this open content analysis, we can also show the topics which most strongly predict a higher or lower father's social class at the same time as the essays were written. And you can see here quite a few things in the ones that predict the higher social class on the left, things that we might think of as economists, for example, as human capital. So this one, lots of mentions about university and college and training. Things that I might think of as social capital, so very much enjoying my friends, my hobbies. And this one, which is quite a material one, I'll come back to it in a moment, but these sort of large modern houses and buildings, I'll call that the large house topic. Whereas on the other side, so we asked the transcribers to transcribe the essays together with all their spelling mistakes, which are thought to have content as well as the sort of subject matter of the essays. So you can see a lot more of sort of spelling mistake type topics here, sort of fragments of words. But also in the more substantive topics that they did write about, they tended to be much more functional, which came up in the example I showed you as well. So at o'clock, bedtime, mum and dad, am now 25 years old, things like that. So I said we're using the essays to see what we can say about predicting the future. And so now I'm just going to run you through quite quickly a number of the projects that we're doing now. It's very much work in progress still, looking at future prediction of the content and the language of the essays. So here are the topics that are predictive of higher future income, and I've given the example here of women. So on the top panel, the topics that are predictive of a higher income later in life. Here we took income at 42. And the lower panel, those that are predictive of a lower income later in life. Now, I've already told you in my introduction about the study that we know that there's a very strong association between social class in childhood, or your income in childhood, and the income that you go on to attain as an adult. And you can see by the topics which predict future income, they're very similar to the ones that predict your current social status, that they may partly just be reflecting the background that the child came from, rather than anything over and above that that's predictive of their future. But of course, using the rich survey controls and the information that we had about their background, we can control for some of that. And interestingly, here you can see the single sort of topic word cloud that is still predictive of future income once you control for a lot of their background characteristics here for women is this one that I called the large house, so the more materialistic sort of topic, which is fascinating, right? I mean, we didn't know what would come up when we looked at it, but certainly, so that sort of area of social mobility and now looking at what things confer resilience and might help people overcome a lower social background and go on to do better later in life is what we're sort of working on now. So we're also in sort of a bit like the Nun study, we're going back and not just looking at sort of topics and the open content analysis, but also some other sort of concepts and constructs in there. So we can also look at complexity in the essays. And here's an example of an essay which scored highly on the measure of complexity that we've used, which is around the length of the words that are used. So this one says, the chemical plant was now running under my supervision as the manager died last week. At home, my interest is electronics, and already I'm manufacturing intercoms on a small scale. So don't worry, it's not Alan Sugar. He's of a different age group to these. But I don't have time to show you all the kind of statistical analysis that underlies it. But what we have found is that high complexity essays predict higher cognitive function at the age of 50, even after you've controlled for the scores that people got in their cognitive tests when they were age 11, when they were at school. So there's some signals in the essays about the complexity of the words that were used that also give you further information about cognitive function later in life. So we've got one strand of the work which is on physical activity. I don't know where JD is here, but I know there he is. So here we've been at great pains to separate out active from passive mentions of sport. So we've taken a slightly different approach where the project team have actively hard-coded 500 of the essays and double-blinded and things like that to score for the 500 that we've read, which ones had active mentions of sport, like the bottom one here. When I go home at night, I go swimming for half an hour, compared to spectator mentions of sport, like the top one. When I come home, I just slump down in a chair and read a paper. And then we've used the 500 that we've scored to train a model that then predicts across all 10,000 of the essays which ones were active or passive mentions of sport. And again, if I could show you the full analysis that we've done, you'd see that for boys in particular, so lots of the kids mention sport. Many, many, many of the boys mention football. What percentage is it that mention football, JD? At least half. At least half. So mentions of active sport go on to predict higher levels of physical activity at almost every age, up to the age of 55 for the boys, whereas passive mentions of sport don't do that. And for the girls, it's not predictive of future sport at all. But there's something there potentially, and that's after controlling for the activities that we're aware that they did at age 11 in terms of sport. So there's something there about active sporting identities and physical activity later in life. So the final one is around mental health, where we're taking another approach again, and I'll need to whiz through this one quite quickly. But instead of doing all the analysis ourselves for this one, we took part in a workshop that was held in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago of the Computational Linguistics and Clinical Psychology group. And essentially, about a month before the workshop, we had a call for participants to come forward who signed up to receive a copy of the essays together with mental health measures from the cohort, both when they were children and throughout their adult lives. And then a total of 8 teams essentially signed up and competed to see who could find the best statistical models to predict, to use the language used in the essays to predict both their current and their future mental health. And the sort of exercise was very much in the spirit of the theme of the workshop as a whole, which you can see here came from one of the tweet posts that came from the workshop. So computers can detect mental health signals in language in ways that humans can't. So I guess the idea is, can you detect mental health signals even from these essays at age 11? So what the study members found, they all found that there were signals of mental health, future and current mental health within the essays, and some models did better at others than predicting it. But certainly the current and the near-term mental health, say at age 23, was much easier for them to predict than the later, longer-term mental health. So, and these are some of the conclusions that we're coming to in this part of this project that we're working on. So I wanted to show you this project first, partly because I wanted you to see that behind the machine learning project, there lies the individual stories of many, many people, like sort of Sally and Steve. And with all the research we do, it's really the individual stories of many people that combine to give us the scientific analysis that we do. And of course, in the spirit of my professorial lecture, I also have my own personal story about how I came to be standing here in these shoes today. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. And to do that, I'm going to... I'm looking at my mum and dad and sister here. This was us back in the early 1970s in our childhood home in New Jersey. I think it was 1972 or 1973. And Lila's my big sister, so I'm the littler one there. Just like we could fast forward sort of 50 years for the cohort members who gave us their photos for the essays, we can fast forward 45 years now. And so you can see underneath there are mum and dad again, not with Lila and me this time, but with my own children, Hannah and Daniel. And Lila there with her son and my nephew, Milo. So we also have some relatively newer members of the family that have joined. So we have Anna, my mum's partner, here, and her son, our brother Sasha. And my partner, Jonathan, together with our very sedate and well-behaved looking children there, Hannah and Daniel again. So I think Milo and Daniel very wisely decided to stay at home with the babysitter tonight. But everybody else is here, and I'm just tremendously sort of grateful and thankful for everything that you've done to support me, both in my career and in all of the rest of the life. And especially Jonathan, who I think this is now the 4th time you've heard me give this talk, Jonathan, isn't it? So I think a special award to Jonathan. But in terms of work, and the first time I can really remember being interested in this kind of work goes back to primary school. And I think just as I hope I showed you with the age 11 essays, I think we all know that primary school is a very formative time. So when I was in what I called the 3rd year, but is now year 5, when I was 9 or 10, our class teacher called Miss Price allowed us the great reward of taking us out of the classroom for several afternoons on maybe a few weeks to let us watch TV. So that was marvellous, and I'd probably remember that anyway. But the TV programme was of particularly sort of great fascination to me. And I don't know how many of you recognise this. These are some of the original 7-year-olds from the Granada TV 7up programme. So for those of you who don't know it, it really genuinely is like a mini NCDS. They're almost exactly the same age as my cohort, and they started following them, but they're a sort of TV version of hand-picked children from different backgrounds. And they started following them at 7, and they've been following them for 7 years, every 7 years since. So I really remember the fascination of where each time we watched a new episode and 7 years had passed, what had happened. But I also remember it very strongly as the first time I think I'd really fully realised and thought and understood about some of the huge social inequalities that there are in our society, and really the kind of major implications of that for these children's lives. So that was me and my class photo from that year, which happened to be a black and white one. And I thought, little did I know at that time that I was going to grow up and at one time become a director of a study that was just like it. But I think if someone had told me that and I'd known that, I would have been very pleased. So, but in terms of my sort of academic life and how that's evolved, so I sat down for this lecture and tried to make a list. Well, based on my CV, I did make a list of everyone who I've ever co-authored research with over the 25 years of my career. And I've put them all here in sort of chronological order. Many of you will see your names up here. So I won't have time to go through kind of all of them and talk about what amazing research we've done together. But in the spirit of the idea that the formative years, or sort of early experiences, are often the most formative, I just want to focus on the top two. So that's Steve Webb and Lorraine Dearden. Where is Lorraine? Where are you? Hello. I told you, did I tell you I would mention you, Lorraine? I think I did. So Steve isn't here tonight, but by making the slides for this presentation, I did get the opportunity to go and see Steve, who I haven't seen for a really long time. And Lorraine, who's now a professor here at IOE, and probably one of the main reasons why I'm a professor at IOE, is here tonight. So, but starting with Steve. So I think what happened was, let me just get my notes. So I first turned up at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, as Becky mentioned, in October 1993. And IFS at that time, it was already very famous as a microeconomic research institute that was full of very, very nerdy people. And I would have to say that Steve would gladly admit that he perhaps was one of the most nerdy of all of them. So you can see him here. He's sitting in front of the Houses of Parliament, because he later went on to, some of you who maybe don't know him personally, he later went on to become an MP and then the pensions minister in the coalition government. But in any case, I just finished my undergraduate degree, and I wrote a letter to IFS asking if there was any work that could be done. And quite fortuitously, my letter landed on the desk of Steve, who'd just been spending a lot of his summer down at what was then called the Public Records Office in Kew, which is now the National Archive. And he'd been painstakingly decoding all these old copies of the family expenditure surveys from the early 1960s that nobody had ever digitized, for a big project on income inequality that he was doing at the time. So I was called in for an interview, which I remember to be very short and extremely grueling, with both Steve and Andrew Dilnott. So is Andrew here yet, Catherine? Andrew, hello. So Andrew was another extremely nerdy man at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I seem to remember, I think, getting maybe most or all of the questions wrong. Certainly the one about income tax and VAT, I did not get right. And the East and West Berlin taxi drivers, yeah. So, but somehow Steve must have been a little bit desperate, because he took me anyway. And very soon I was very hard at work at this very painstaking project, coding up the old income figures from the old family expenditure surveys. And so the kind of unique thing about this project that I did with Steve was that it was the first time that we'd had a consistent series going back over 3 decades for looking at the income distribution across the UK. So people like Paul Johnson, who's here, who's now director of IFS, and Steve had already been beginning to realise that there'd been this massive rise in income inequality over the 1980s. But what we didn't really know is how that fit into the kind of pattern of a longer period of time. So by drawing this first graph, this Gini coefficient, which is an index of income inequality on a completely consistent basis, and going back over 3 decades, we were able to confirm that this rise in income inequality in the UK over the 1980s really was extremely large and very unprecedented. And I'll come back to causes in a moment. But one thing that I remember, Paul, we talked about a lot of the time and speculated that it would be very hard for a massive rise in inequality like that to be very easily reversed. And I'm very proud that IFS have been consistently updating this series every single year since then. So we have 25 more years of data to add on. And I think you've been doing the launch of the latest statistics today. Is that right? So it does remain the fact that that very large rise in income inequality, which occurred during the 1980s, although there's been fluctuations ever since, it has not reversed. So we did a lot of analysis around these statistics, looking at poverty rates and the fact that poverty had gone up both on relative and absolute terms, both within and between groups, among people of working age as well as the older population. And as I said before, there was a certain way that we could get using this kind of data that was repeated cross-sectional data about the causes. So, for example, we saw that there are a lot more people who had become unemployed in the early 1980s who were on low incomes. And using the IFS micro-simulation model, my friend Tom Clark, where are you, Tom? I saw you come in. Hello. Tom did some analysis showing, so your famous fiscal studies paper, Tom, showing that a part of the reason for the big increase in inequality is that among those on benefits, because benefits had been uprated in line with prices rather than incomes, which had been the historic norm, that was one of the big reasons for the growth in inequality. But another one of the reasons, which is where Lorraine comes in, related to education. So we could see, so with the data that Steve and I had been using, you could see very clearly that those with higher education were paid more and had higher incomes than those with lower levels of education. And actually that's just one of the core reasons across, not just in the UK, but across all societies, why societies are economically unequal, because those with higher skills and higher education are typically paid more than those with less. And so a big part of the sort of research industry at that time, looking at the reasons why income inequality had grown so much, was looking at the returns to education. And there was a clear indication that the returns to getting educational degrees and becoming higher educated had gone up a lot during the 1980s. So the value in the labour market of having a higher education compared to having no skills had really sort of expanded. So at that time, Lorraine, were you the first or one of the first PhD scholars at IFS? You were the first. So Lorraine was doing her PhD at this time using this amazing new data source that economists had only first been able to start getting a hold of. And that data source, it turned out to be the age 33 sweep. So I said, remember this timeline at the beginning. It was the age 33 sweep of the NCDS. And Lorraine had been looking at this to get closer into the robust measures of what were the returns to education for people in the labour market then. And the great joy and uniqueness of the NCDS at that time, because people who are higher educated select into education and choose to go into education on the basis of all kinds of attributes. If you want a true causal estimate of what the benefits of education are, it's very hard in the kind of cross-sectional data that Steve and I were using to estimate that separately from the benefits of all kinds of other attributes that you don't normally measure. So the wonderful thing about NCDS, which had been following its participants from birth and through their schooling years and up to the age of 33 at that time, is that we'd taken all these cognitive measures in the tests at school, so you could control for their cognitive ability and then look at what the causal or a closer estimate of the causal effects of education were. And of course, we found that having an education was of great benefit to the people in NCDS by the age of 33 in terms of their income, for women particularly more so than men, but for both. But one of the really important byproducts of that research, I would say, Lorraine, was not only were there high returns to the labour market for gaining an education, but we could see very, very strongly the social patterning of who got higher levels of education compared to who didn't. Because as well as these cognitive tests, we'd been collecting parental background measures for the whole time. And you could see that it was very much those from higher income backgrounds who typically went on to get higher levels of education in the first place. And there you could see straight away that one of the root causes of inequality that we'd been looking to explain in the cross-sectional data with Steve was this very strong intergenerational link. So this link between advantage in childhood and advantage in adult life working through educational attainment. So these were some of the reports that we wrote on this topic. And as I said, this thing about social inequalities and access to education was essentially a bit of a byproduct, I would say, from this research. But at the same time, my friend Howard Reed, who was one of the people working on us together with Lorraine and Richard Blundell on this project, Howard had, I think, probably the best master's dissertation sort of project ever, because he, together with Lorraine and Steve Machin, worked on this very sort of seminal paper, which I think is one of the greatest papers in economics to come from NCDS, which was estimating for the first time these important parameters of intergenerational income mobility in Britain. And here, just as I've been saying, they find a clear intergenerational correlation between fathers and sons and daughters in terms of labour market earnings and years of schooling. So if you're thinking about what some of the core reasons are for inequality in societies like ours, there's this intergenerational persistence of socioeconomic status across generations. And lots of our research proceeded to look more deeply into that. Here's just one picture from a project where we started to look at the available data at the time on childhood to tell us both about what were the inequalities in schooling, in cognitive development, and what were some of the reasons behind it. So here we had the most current data that we had available to us at the time, and around the mid-2000s, so around the time I had you, Hannah. And we had, along the x-axis here, we had data from the Millennium Cohort study, ages 3 and 5, and then we pieced that together with the ALSPAC, the Bristol Cohort, from ages 7 and 11, and then what was then the LSYPE, which is now the Next Steps cohort that we run at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies at 14 and 16. And along this axis here was a ranking in the cognitive test score distribution. And we split children up by whether they were from the poorest or middle or richest income quintiles in terms of their family background. So you can see here that there was a very strong gradient in performance in cognitive test score distribution according to your family background, with the lowest essentially having on average the lowest rank and successively higher as you move up the income distribution, and the highest having the highest rank. So among the various factors that we looked at to explain that, we looked at differences in the home learning environment, differences in access to schooling. But one of the factors that came out really strongly in that project and in subsequent work that I've done comes back to this poster that I showed you at the beginning about mental health problems, and they don't always start in adults. So one of the great foresighted things about the studies in the cohorts like NCDS is that they started collecting childhood mental health measures early on as well. And we could see this graph now is using current data, and it's been drawn by my PhD student Matt van Poortvliet recently, using the Millennium Cohort study all the way up from age 3 now all the way to the age of 14. And you can see here, so this is using something called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a short battery of questions that were given mainly to parents in the Millennium Cohort study. And we've been able, so here the pattern's basically inverted because it's about difficulties rather than attainment. But what you can see here is another very clear gradient, which is the highest average levels of difficulty for those among the poorest income quintiles at the top, and successively lower difficulties as you go down through to the richest quintiles. And again, those inequalities start young and they persist. So alongside that, more work on mental health that then provides the link between childhood and these inequalities in childhood and inequality in older life. You see here in a paper that I was fortunate enough to co-author with Jim Smith and with Rob Joyce in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. You can see here that we found that the economic costs related to childhood mental disorders were very high and far more important, just for example, than physical illnesses during the childhood years. So I think one of the great achievements of these cohorts, and I'm glad to have been part of this work, is that child's mental health is really in the spotlight now. So not just because of very high-profile campaigners like the royal family, Prince Harry and so on, but also because of the type of the research that we can do with cohort studies like ours. And so on the day of the royal wedding, last month, we were very proud to share the front page of The Guardian with this story from the Millennium, from our research, Pravitha Patley and Emma Fitzsimons, who are here, their research on the depression risk as revealed in today's Millennium Cohort study, and here highlighting also that risk for those from poor families. And this quote, which I find very important in there, in that newspaper article, after decades in the shadows, children's mental health is finally in the spotlight. So the last sort of block of things that I wanted to talk to you about, I've emphasised the importance of early experience, and clearly our cohorts are unique in being able to show something which I think is intuitively familiar to us, and possibly it's intuitively familiar to us because of all this body of research that's been done. But one thing that I've been learning since I've been the principal investigator of NCDS, and we've been doing some work now going up as far as the age 55 sweep, which was the most recent data collection that we've done, is that it isn't just early life that matters. And one particular project that we've done with a number of colleagues of you who are here is looking at disadvantage across the whole of adult life and seeing how accumulated disadvantage across adult life potentially puts you at risk as you start to approach your older age. So it's a great pleasure for me, having started my work looking at the income distribution on cross-sectional data, to be able to show you this graph, which is using the NCDS and the income measures that we've taken at every major sweep from the study. And this is how the distribution of income has evolved across almost a whole working lifetime for within the NCDS study. So you can see, for me, this is quite a beautiful graph because you can see something which you would predict across a life cycle in economics, which is that income, this is the median and then the 10th and the 90th percentiles, income has typically grown in real terms for the cohort. But it started off quite equal when they were back in their early 20s and has become increasingly unequal across the cohort as they've gone through their lives. So we've been able to take data like this. Where is Sam? Hello. We've been able to take this data and construct measures of poverty across the working lifetime. And we basically split people into whether they'd ever been poor relative to the rest of their cohort, never been poor, ever but intermittently been poor, and then persistently been poor. So persistently at the bottom of the income distribution at each of these ages. And we started this project because we were looking at what the prospects for extended working lives were for this group of people as they were in their mid-50s. But one of the really kind of strongest, I would say, byproducts of this, we could see strong inequalities in the expectations of longer working lives according to your income across your lifetime. But one of the really strong sort of byproducts of this work was the fact that it's just so startlingly obvious how strongly disadvantaged on multiple fronts those who've been persistently on low incomes throughout their life are by the time that they reach age 55, and quite the extent to which those people will be approaching their older age with quite some vulnerability. So these are those who were we classified as persistently poor, which was about 8% of the cohort, so around the bottom 10th or so in terms of their lifetime income. They were much less likely to be living with a partner by the time of age 55, and the incomes are equivalized, so they're adjusted to take into account the family size. Didn't just have low income because they're on their own. Much more likely than the rest of the cohort to be living in rented housing rather than owning their home, which is another huge source of security for people approaching their older age. much less likely to be in employment even at the age of 55, much more likely to have never paid into a pension scheme, so to have no pension wealth as they approach their older age, much more likely to be in poor physical health, and also to have indicators of poor kind of mental well-being. So I guess this project, just to bear in mind that early experiences matter, but actually supporting people at disadvantage throughout their working lives and not just in relation to childhood is incredibly important. So there were lots of other things that I wanted to tell you about this evening that I discovered through the multiple practices that Jonathan helped me with that I just do not have time. So one of those things is that I really wanted to tell you about some of the really amazing work we're doing at the moment on generational change. So taking the cohorts all together and looking at how across these cohorts at the same age but at a different time, how they're faring, and particularly in relation to their health. So, for example, looking at the mental health of the 1958 cohort and the 1970 cohort, comparing them both at the age 42, we can see signs that the 1970 cohort are much more likely to report poor mental health and show stronger signs of depression at a given age than the 1958 cohort were. And that's even despite the fact that the 1970 cohort have on average a higher education than the 1958 cohort, and probably around the same income at age 42. And also work by some of my colleagues in CLS looking at body mass and obesity over time. So each successive generation at a given age is now sort of not only getting heavier as they go through their lifetime, but each cohort heavier than the one before. So real kind of signs of sort of public health risks among younger cohorts that we've been working on a lot. And I would have liked to have shown you. A final thing I would have liked to have told you about was about some of the amazing, some of the really good work we're doing on methods in CLS. So some of you may be wondering, did we keep the whole cohort in place, or have some of them left the study over time? So there's lots that we're doing about dealing with attrition from studies and using statistical methods to restore the studies to their nationally representative originals. And lots of work that we're also doing. I haven't talked much about causal identification, just a little bit in relation to the Returns to Education project. But lots that we're doing to think about how we can obtain robustly causal estimates from observational data like this. So I will tell you a tiny bit about the upcoming age 61 sweep of the NCDS. Becky, you mentioned it. I'm really proud that we now have a very strong consortium of funders for the age 61 sweep. And one of the themes that we're going to be looking at is intergenerational mobility, by finding out a lot more than we ever have in the past about the children of the NCDS cohort members, and in particular what help as parents cohort members have been giving to their children, or are planning to be given to their children, which may result in perpetuation of disadvantage and inequalities further down the road. Something that the Resolution Foundation and lots of the comments that I hear you making, Paul, highlighting sort of the importance of gifts and transfers in this sort of perpetuation of inequalities across generations. So the age 60 sweep is going to be a fantastic opportunity to look at that. We have a second adult nurse home visit. So we're going to be taking all kinds of biomarkers from the blood of the cohort members and looking at, given a set of potential adversities that the cohort has experienced across its life, what factors might confer resilience or enable people who are potentially at high risk for health problems in their older life? What things in middle age can people do, or what relevant policies can we identify to help reverse those risks? So maybe thinking about the disadvantage project, what can we do for those people who have accumulated disadvantage across their adult lives? So the last thing that I didn't have time to talk to you about, I can see 15 seconds on my clock, so I think I've done quite well. I'm currently blessed with some wonderful PhD students. So I mentioned Matt van Poortvliet, who'd drawn the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire for the lecture tonight. And there's also Catherine Dilnott, who's here. Where are you, Catherine? Yay. And Claire Tyler, who couldn't come here tonight, and who I've been jointly supervising both with Morag Henderson and with Lindsay McMillan. And there's Lindsay with her lovely daughter Isla, when you were on maternity leave last year, came in for one of our supervisions. That's how nice they are, that you come in for them on maternity leave. But we're doing some fantastically exciting work at the moment on social mobility and recruitment into large firms. So we've been talking with a number of large firms and have our hands on some amazing data about the applicants into large firms and the social backgrounds that they come from and how they're faring through the applications process. So I'm really thrilled that, Lindsay, you've agreed to be my responder this evening. And thank you. I will leave you with that nice animation that I started with. So, thank you.
Alissa, thank you. That was absolutely terrific, fascinating. I think that we all got a sense of the breadth and depth of the cohorts and the data sets that you're working with, the breadth and depth of your own work, and the huge social importance and impact of that work that's continued over the life of the cohorts, but also that you're drawing out in your own work and findings and the really important influence that that's having. So thank you for that. Now, I'm really pleased to introduce our respondent to this evening's lecture, Lindsay McMillan, Reader in Economics at the IOE. And Lindsay's principal research interests concern intergenerational transmissions of worklessness and income mobility. In particular, her work considers the role of education and non-cognitive skills in such transfers, as well as the role of family background in accessing social positions of power and prestige. And Lindsay's research has also tackled undermatch in higher education. She's challenged the role of grammar schools in promoting social mobility, and she's looked at accounts for the success of London schools and the cost of youth unemployment. The research is addressing and influencing, again, really vital policy issues. Such analysis, of course, requires access to large data sets, including, for example, the National Pupil Database and the Labour Force Survey, but also, of course, the birth cohort studies. So, Lindsay, can I invite you to give your response to the lecture? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Becky, and thanks, Alissa. That was truly brilliant, and you should be really proud. Honestly, it was fantastic. So, okay, first of all, I'm going to have a play around. There we go. So I was really touched when Alissa asked me to respond to her professorial lecture. Alissa's been a really important part of my career, particularly in the last 5 years, a very valued colleague. I was also, therefore, a little bit anxious. I've never done this before, and I really didn't want to let you down. But I've talked to a lot of colleagues, and I've done some research into Alissa's career, and I now realise this is a really easy gig. I could basically speak for hours on the subject of Alissa Goodman. That's my specialist subject going forward. But don't worry, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to keep us from the drinks reception. But I do just want to spend 10 minutes just talking through briefly some of the contributions that myself and other close colleagues of yours think are most important, including some things that you didn't get a chance to mention here. So a constant phrase that came up when I was speaking to colleagues about Alissa was the phrase rigour. I don't think you realise yourself how good people think you are, how good you are, okay? People respect you so much for your academic rigour. It's a kind of credit and a statement to Alissa that when I asked her what she thought I should do tonight, she suggested that I present some challenges to her professorial lecture. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to roast everything that you've ever done. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'll save that for later. No. But seriously, that's, a statement about the rigour that you've kind of brought so far. And I know you talked about this contribution, but I just wanted to reiterate that right from the beginning, there was rigour there with the research, okay? I spoke to Andrew Dilnott, And I'm going to quote him. He says that this work you did on income inequality with the FES going back to 61 was really groundbreaking. It was characteristically careful and thoughtful in its approach, and it really has laid the foundation for much that follows. As Alissa highlighted, this research on income inequality led to a new strand of research on intergenerational income mobility. This is a subject which is very close to my own heart. Something which is not well known and something that Alissa didn't mention in her talk and always fails to mention is that there was some really important research on intergenerational income mobility in the early 2000s, and that research has been hugely influential in terms of policy impact. Using the NCDS and the BCS cohort studies, Alissa, along with other co-authors Joe Blandon, Steve Machin and Paul Gregg, showed that intergenerational income mobility in the UK has got worse over time. As I said, I really don't think I can overstate the impact that that research and research that followed it had in terms of setting the climate for social policy in the UK for the past decade. Social mobility, improving social mobility, has become the number one social policy of numerous governments ever since. Alissa talked a lot about the important role of educational inequalities in this and has made a lot of contributions herself, which she highlighted in terms of, during her time as Programme Director of Education and Skills at IFS. I think one major contribution that she didn't get a chance to mention was the work that she did with Lorraine and Emla and Greg Kaplan around higher education funding reforms. Now, this was in the mid-2000s when fees went up for the first time, and there was a lot of nervousness about what the impact of these funding reforms would have on poorer students in particular, if it would deter them from going into higher education. And this paper is a good example of the type of work that Alissa was doing, and actually the first figure there is showing that actually the overall impact of the policy was largely positive for families for students from poorer families. Alissa talked a lot about her interest in how it widened beyond education, and she showed you the important work that she did with Jim Smith and Rob Joyce on mental health and non-cognitive skills. She's also done a report more recently, I see you there, Haroon, for the Early Intervention Foundation with colleagues in the department, which showcased the well-known kind of thoughtfulness and rigour in measuring social and emotional skills in the cohort studies. But another important contribution on kind of wider outcomes that I think is very important is work that she's done with Claire Crawford, Ellen Greaves, and again Rob Joyce for the Nuffield Foundation, looking at marriage versus cohabitation. Now, if you cast your mind back to 2010, this was at a time when the coalition government was looking to incentivise marriage in the tax system. In the research, they made two really important contributions. The first one is shown on this graph, which is that almost all of the increase in non-marital births that occurred since the 1980s in the UK actually came from cohabiting couples rather than lone parents. This research is hugely well cited and very important. But the other important thing they showed in that project was that actually the differences in child outcomes between people from children from married families compared to cohabiting families were quite small, and they were all driven by selection into marriage. Or if you want to say that another way, that actually incentivising marriage in the tax system isn't actually going to have any effect on child outcomes. This report was very well received in government, and it's still cited today and hugely influential. There's no more graphs. I'm just going to leave this picture of Alissa up there for the next 5 minutes so that she can get more and more embarrassed as I start to talk about soppy stuff. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the evolution of Alissa's career in terms of, first of all, at the IFS, working on big administrative data, focusing on programme evaluations such as the educational maintenance allowance, and then more recently, obviously, the benefit for us, her working on the brilliant cohort studies that we have here. First in her role as PI of the NCDS and now as Director of CLS. I think it's fair to say that under Alissa's leadership at CLS, The centre is recognised both in terms of the wonderful resource centre it is, but also in terms of being a high-quality, multidisciplinary research centre. Colleagues regularly mention that Alissa is truly supportive of a cross-discipline approach, despite being an economist. She shows a genuine interest in learning from different backgrounds, different disciplines with alternative experiences and views, and she brings this into CLS and makes CLS really a social science centre fit for the 21st century. To speak a little bit more generally about Alissa now, as well as having a great vision for the big picture things, she also cares a lot about the little things. She's a really thoughtful, incredibly caring colleague who takes the time to send a text message at midnight if you've had a bad day, just to check in, despite all the other things that are going on in her life. And it's those kind of things that colleagues speak most warmly about. She's been an excellent role model for many of us. I know myself, as I've taken on additional responsibilities over the last few years, I've often found myself thinking, what would Alissa do in this situation? And truly has never left me very far wrong. In the 12 years that I've known her, we've been very lucky to share a lot of good experiences together. One that springs to mind is that we both got to, Tom, you'll appreciate this, we both got to stay in this very luxurious Jacobean mansion in the Crewe countryside with a group of American colleagues and to discuss the problem of inequality and what we were going to do about it. And I genuinely think the irony was not really felt across all parties, but we obviously appreciated that this was a brilliant situation. The helicopter to be flown down to London was a particularly class moment. What are we going to do about inequality? But kind of looking forward, despite all these shared experiences, I cannot believe that I am not on that slide of co-authors. So one of the things I'm most excited about going forward in terms of my own personal experience with Alissa is working on this project that she talked about. Really important work with our fantastically brilliant PhD students, Catherine and Claire, who we couldn't have done it without. We're making progress in getting access, well, we now have access to applications data for big firms, and we're going to hopefully do some really exciting work together. But I think also more generally, there are a lot of exciting things to come for Alissa and for CLS. Thanks to her persistence, determination, blood, sweat and tears, maybe not blood, but definitely tears, there is finally funding in place for the biomedical suite for NCDS 61. I know that was a hard process, and well done you for getting it through. I think this, combined with her encouragement for this multidisciplinary research and embracing as well the use of genetics data in social science, will mean that Alissa and CLS will remain at the forefront of social sciences for years to come, and I can't wait to see it. Okay?
Lindsay, thanks so much for that wonderful distillation and tribute. It was really heartfelt, and I think we would all share your warm support. It's been a really terrific evening, and it falls to me now to welcome you all to please stay and have a drink, alcoholic or otherwise, with us, and to celebrate Alissa's success. But let's just take the chance to give one more vote of thanks to our speakers. Thank you.